Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. So as I said last week, we're starting a series of webinars over the next 3 weeks that we're going to cover different aspects of winter housing, selecting cows and tubing technique in relation to drying off cows, which is quite literally only right around the corner now at this stage. A lot of cows are going to start, or well, heifers in particular, as I've said in the last couple of weeks, are going to be starting to be dried off in the next fortnight or 3 weeks, and indeed some may already be dried off in earlier calving herds further south. So as I said, today we're going to focus a little bit on, very briefly, on winter housing, I suppose, and the role that that can play in terms of ensuring a successful dry period. So I suppose this is in conjunction with AHI, and they'll be running Cell Check Week next week, and I'll show you the details around that. There's just some videos going to be released on different topics and emphasizing the importance of doing your dry period and dry therapy correctly, especially in light of the changes that are coming down the tracks at us. So from the 28th of January of next year, even though the legislation hasn't been decided fully as to what it's going to be, there will be a reduction, or there will be a removal of blanket dry cow therapy as we're currently able to avail of. So this is the last season that people will be able to just actively get a prescription for dry cow tubes, and if they want to apply them to all cows. So I suppose we need to be looking at the scenario of selective and how we can make that work on our farms. And as I said, there's going to be bits and pieces. Willie Buckley will be on next week to talk about selecting the cows that are appropriate for drying off using selective dry cow therapy. And that's one part of the process. Then the week after, Dan is going to talk about the actual tubing technique, which is also another part of the process, but probably one of the processes that we don't maybe put enough emphasis on, or in our own heads maybe, or on our own farms, is around the whole housing element of the dry cow period and how that influences the performance of the dry cow therapy that we are using. That said, winter housing also has an influence in terms of mastitis control while cows are milking, and especially in the springtime, I suppose, to a lesser extent maybe in the later part of lactation, because cows aren't maybe as full, don't tend to leak as much maybe, but we often see where we have difficult months of February and cows are housed for long periods of time as a result, where people will be banking on getting out earlier maybe in order to kind of alleviate pressure on housing, that can backfire in terms of causing a significant amount of mastitis in herds like that. So I'm just going to go through a couple of slides in relation to dry cow housing and our winter housing, and how that's going to influence your mastitis situation. So just full screen here. So winter housing and mastitis prevention. I suppose the objective that we're trying to provide when we're housing our stock is to provide a clean, dry environment for the cow to lie down on, or lie down in. And if we can achieve those, we're going to be a long, long way to achieving a good process, or a good scenario from the point of view of creating the right environment that's low in a bacterial loading scenario, so that if our cow is lying in that environment, the risk that's posed to them of contracting something via that environment is reduced quite significantly. So clean is obviously something that we can control ourselves quite significantly by the practices that we employ on our farms and how we go about keeping our cubicles clean. The dry environment can be a factor of a number of issues, I suppose, and we'll take a look at them in a second. So cleanliness, as I said already, the objective is that you're reducing the bacterial load. You'll all know that with the best will in the world, there'll be a lot of houses that are spotlessly clean now at the moment, just before cows are going in, having been power washed, maybe disinfected even, which would be the creme de la creme, I suppose. Before housing, there are people then that have no housing washed at all, and for some reason they manage to get away with it. But ideally, you would have your facilities very clean, very well washed at least, and disinfected before cows are housed at all. That's getting you off to a good start. Obviously, if there's still the remnants of dung and bacteria possibly that were left on the cubicles when cows finished using them in March or April last year possibly, then there's the possibility that they can get reactivated again. I suppose they can lie dormant to a certain extent because they're not exposed particularly to sunlight, which could dry them out and kill them. So there is a possibility that when a damp environment comes around them again, that they could reactivate again. So reducing the bacterial load is important. I suppose how often we clean cubicles then is obviously going to have a significant role in terms of reducing that bacterial load. So obviously if you go through your cubicle shed at least once a day during the dry period and clean and dust or lime or whatever material you want to use in terms of bedding those cubicles, then you're impacting on the bacterial load that's in the cow's other environment when they're lying down. Cleaning cubicles is probably something that is highly recommended in terms of during the dry period. You often hear people saying that they do nothing once cows are dried off. Find it hard to believe how that can be successful, given that with the best will in the world, with the best shed in the world, cubicles are going to be some way soiled nearly every day anyway, because cows are stepping up and stepping off onto passageways, and they are going to carry bacteria up onto that, and obviously then their feet are in the general vicinity of where the rudder is when they lie down, so there is going to be a bacterial load there, and if that's not cleaned away and disinfected, I suppose, to some extent, then the risk is going to be increased, obviously, of bacteria accessing the udder through the teat canal potentially. So for milking cows, I suppose, would be where they're housed fully, which is possibly coming in the next number of weeks now as grass is beginning to fade away. Definitely going to be in by night, if not already in by night on farms around the country soon. So we have to clean those cubicles every time the cows are on those cubicles. So scrape them off or brush them off and use lime or peat or sawdust. I suppose sawdust and lime would be the most common, lime in particular being the most common. And I suppose just even maybe the choice of disinfecting those cubicles during the dry period with maybe the likes of a liquid disinfectant can actually have a positive impact in terms of mastitis prevention as well. So twice a day for dry cows immediately post dry off. I have that there with question marks. Obviously time is a limiting factor for a lot of people, and it is one of the most time consuming jobs on a farm is liming cubicles because it's slow. There's a bit of toing and froing. A lot of people beginning to move in the direction of automating that to a certain extent in terms of machines to do them, and obviously that speeds up the process, and it also, like everything we talk about, it's regularizing how that job is done on the farm as well. So if I'm doing the cubicles, or if a different person is doing the cubicles, if there's a machine being used for it and everybody knows how to use the machine, the process will be done generally the same. However, different people will scrape cubicles differently, may lime them differently, and that can vary. There can be variation in the quality of the job done then basically between different operators. So again, I suppose at the very minimum, I would be suggesting that people will lime dry cow cubicles once a day, even during the dry period when everything is shut down completely. From a labour management point of view, I think the most successful way is probably either pushing in feed or putting in fresh feed. Encourages cows to get up and go to the feed barrier. Another emphasis here, I suppose, is that cows have adequate access to feed barrier, which means that all cows can feed at the same time. That generally tends to empty cubicle beds and allows a person to come in maybe and work relatively freely without having to get cows up and so forth out of their way, and can speed up the process of actually cleaning the cubicles. So pushing in feed, as I said, generally encourages cows to get up, and that makes the job of cleaning cubicles for dry cows a little bit easier. Obviously with milking cows, it's very easy. They're moved to the collecting yard and the cubicle spaces are free then to clean. But just maybe working a little bit smarter around how you're managing your feed can actually help to encourage dry cows to be off the beds when you want to clean them. So clean cubicles are a priority anyway, I think, especially for milking cows, and without a doubt for dry cows in the immediate post dry off period, and for definite. And we would recommend strongly that people lime their cubicles during the dry period as well. So I suppose the situation around the actual post dry off period, why are we saying for maybe to do it twice a day at that stage? So when we tube cows, we're putting in sealers now. If we're going into a non-antibiotic environment, we're depending on that sealer to do the job for us. And to a certain extent, obviously, we wouldn't be using them if they weren't going to do something. But at the same time, you want to give them every chance to be effective. And as you know, even with low volumes of milk being produced immediately prior to dry off, and I spoke about it a couple of weeks ago, in terms of making sure the cows are kind of shutting down in advance of using any tubes on them, they will tend to bag up a small bit in the immediate post dry off period, because they're expecting to be milked. Their brain is quite literally telling them that they should be milked, and there's that signal from the udder of milk not being removed from the udder. Has to go back to the brain to tell the brain to stop telling the udder to start letting down milk. So it just does take a few days. So cows do swell a little bit. There's a bit of oedema maybe associated with the post dry off period. And we need to make sure that those cubicles are as clean as possible to prevent any risk of bacteria. It's going back to that, reducing the bacterial load in the udder area, so that there isn't going to be a piece of muck or dirt at the end of a teat that, while it has been sealed, it's obviously, if there's contact there constantly, there's a risk. Bacteria are minute, they're small, they could potentially get in around it and get into the udder. And we have that awkward scenario then of where we're trying to maybe treat a dry cow for mastitis potentially, or it develops into mastitis over the dry period, which hits us then in the busy spring period. So I would say, from the point of view of the dry cow period, if you could manage to dry, or to, as cows or group cows as they're being dried off, and maybe if you're not in a position to give that kind of level of focus to drying, to cubicle management for the whole herd, at least focus on making sure that the cubicles of the cows that have been dried off in the very recent times are kept to a very high standard for possibly 2 to 3 weeks post dry off. Okay. But again, I will emphasize that the ideal scenario is that we're keeping all cubicles at a very high standard of hygiene throughout the dry period, in order to minimize those bacterial loads that are coming into contact with cows. Again, helping to reduce those bacterial loads then is keeping feeding areas and passageways clean. So running scrapers very regularly, every 6 to 8 hours. Obviously, with smaller volumes of slurry being pushed down through the passageways then, as a result of that, rather than quite big volumes being shoved, if running them less frequently. And I suppose removing the build-up, obviously, when we move on to silage, we tend to get a bit of a drier dung forming. And at the end of scrapers, and in many cases, you can find a build-up. There are options out there, I suppose, for kind of pieces that can be put onto the end of scrapers that will work as the scraper is moving back and forth, in order to work the build-up of material down through slats at the end of it. But if you don't have that option, it's probably advisable to be moving away every few days at least, if not every day, maybe moving away the build-up that comes at the end of the scrapers. Now, it has its advantages in that if that build-up gets significant, sometimes scrapers can hop off and they don't work, obviously, for a period of time, and then we have a very significant build-up as well. And that creates its own problems in that passageways get dirty, and cows are standing on passageways, then they step up onto cubicles, and they obviously, if they have very dirty feet, as they step up onto the cubicle, they're now making their cubicle very dirty as well. The other thing that's good from the point of view of removing that build-up is, unless you've quite a big wide area at the end of the cubicle passage, or the scraper passage, that cows can actively avoid walking through the build-up. If they're forced to walk through that build-up, it means that their hooves are now getting quite dirty and can be quite wet as well, as a result of stepping through that dung at the end of the cubicles or scraper passages on an ongoing basis. And that can have a negative impact in terms of mortellaro developing over the winter period in particular, because mortellaro can, if it's in the environment, but the environment is managed relatively well, it can be managed as such. But if it's in the environment and the environment isn't managed well, it can materialize. So I suppose again, no different to keeping the udder clean and dry, we're also looking to try and keep hooves as clean and dry as possible as well, to minimize the risk of those kind of infections. And again, wetting of hooves, obviously many people will have seen it there in the last number of weeks, with passageways getting that bit soft and the fat coming up through them, as the description goes, in the last couple of weeks as well, and how that can affect lameness as well. So obviously the same applies. we're now standing on a very hard surface in concreted areas in particular. So we need good, strong hooves. So we don't want to be weighting those hooves, which is going to soften them any further. So if we can help that, that works from a hoof health point of view, but particularly effective in terms of keeping the cubicles clean. In terms of the dryness, I suppose, why are we talking about dryness? Cubicles need to be kept dry because moisture encourages bacterial growth. So you'll see that in anything that you do, maybe if there's a bit of bacteria left in the corner of a shed. Calf houses are a good example of it, I suppose. Bacterial growth over time, if it's left there, you'll all have seen bits of fur and stuff developing, which is bacterial growth in a lot of cases, where bacteria are left in place, and the moisture obviously is in contact with them as well. So we often talk about cleaning calf houses, that we need to reduce them or remove the manure and then let them dry out. And that drying out effect is important in terms of killing bacteria as much as possible. And we talk about taking the gates and so forth out of a calf house and putting them outside in UV sunlight, so that you get desiccation of the bacteria, but you also get the effect of the UV on it as well. So you can't do that with a shade, so you need to try and make sure that it's dry. Fall of the cubicle is going to be important in terms of shedding the liquid. And what I mean by shedding the liquid is everybody will have cows that are just going to lie in the cubicle and lift their tail and urinate on the cubicle maybe. You want that to flow off the cubicle, and that's going to help to keep the cubicle dry in itself. So obviously in the immediate post urination period, when the cow has done what she's done, the cubicle is wet. But if the fall is correct on the cubicle, it's going to dry off itself more or less naturally, in that the liquid will shed off the cubicle bed itself. Where it might not dry is when we come to the next point. So shed ventilation is a factor. And I suppose we've probably seen it in a number of cases, and maybe you've come across it at different stages as well, in relation to where sheds have been or where herds are expanding, and there hasn't been the capacity, I suppose, or we're building the numbers maybe before we're building the shed, which has been the case on a lot of farms in the last number of years. And as a result, sheds are quite heavily stocked, and shed ventilation comes under pressure because we've more animals in that shed than we should have on a per meter square basis or per meter cube basis in terms of ventilation. So the ventilation is compromised within the shed, and basically we kind of have a damp, moist environment in that shed on an ongoing basis. And it's very hard for the cubicles then to be dry in that scenario. And that's a factor also in terms of cubicle hygiene and so forth as well. So shed ventilation, the shed itself, or the overstocking of the shed can influence. So how can we get around that? I suppose we've a couple of weeks maybe to housing, or maybe in the next number of weeks, I suppose, before sheds are very stocked. There may be an opportunity to adjust the ventilation of a shed by particularly on older roofs, maybe where there might be low, just raising sheets if they're not already raised, in order to just let out the heat that's been generated by the stock, that stack effect that we often talk about, which will just basically move the moisture from the shade, and that in itself will help dry the environment as well. I suppose then again, I've often seen worn cubicles, or worn cubicle mats probably aren't the end of the world to an extent, but what they can do is maybe harbor moisture. If there are little cracks or crevices in them, they can hold moisture in place. What is a bigger issue is probably where you see cubicle mats curling, obviously at the ends. So individual mats are probably more prone to it than the rolls of matting, obviously because of the weight of the roll of matting, but individual mats curling up at the ends of the cubicle, and as a result they're creating a pond effect in the lying environment of the cow. So they should be replaced in order to, again, allow the cubicle bed and mat to have the fall of the cubicle bed. And that cubicle bed then, obviously, by virtue of its fall, or cubicle mat, by virtue of the fall of the bed that it's placed on, should shed the liquid that we're trying to eliminate from the cubicle area and the lying area of the cow. There are some people across the country using straw. Again, I suppose that the vast majority of cows in the country are on cubicle bedding for the most part. But if you are using straw, it's no different. Again, a lot of this ties in with calf housing, I suppose. If you are using straw, you need to use a lot of it to maintain dry conditions. And the slope of the floor is going to be important there, no different to calf housing. The slope of the floor it's shedding the liquid basically. So if there is a liquid landing on the surface, that it's been moved away from the bedding area, so that the bedding isn't actually just lying in liquid, which is going to influence the dryness of that bedding, obviously. So if you are using straw bedding, and it's same for calving areas as well, trying to, when we do come to that point in time, which can then influence mastitis also, keeping them clean in terms of using lots of straw to keep them clean, but keeping them dry by using a lot of straw and having good falls on the floor in order to eliminate the liquid from underneath is important as well. I suppose coming back to the cubicles element of it then, spacious cubicles with a mat would be recommended. Now, there are some people maybe that still have concrete cubicles. They're cold, they're hard. Cows probably, if they don't have a choice, will lie in them, but obviously it's easier to clean a mat than to clean concrete cubicles, I suppose. So they should be comfortable as possible and spacious. So I suppose spacious is talking about your kind of 1.1 meter spacing in terms of width. The length, you can see that some cubicles where they're fitted into houses that are narrow cubicle beds as such, they don't have great depth. Cows maybe don't lie in them as well, so that influences the usage of the cubicle, which is important as well. And second point there is making that the area needs to be comfortable to lie down on. So look, there isn't a whole lot of time maybe to do something in that regard, but maybe for the coming year, it might be something that you need to examine. So look at your cows lying down. Do they lie down pretty readily into the cubicle? Are they comfortable when they are lying down? Are they comfortable when they're getting up? Do you see a lot of cows lying down a lot of the time during the winter period? So they come to the barrier, they feed, they go lie down. That's the ideal scenario. It's no different to being out of grass, only that they're inside in the shed. You want them to eat and lie down. When they're lying down, they're content generally, and obviously they're off their feet as well, which is good for hoof health again. So those comfortable lying areas are important. And I suppose the brisket board then is the contrary to the shorter cubicles. So some cubicles can be quite long and cows can be quite far in on the cubicle, and that doesn't lend to, while it might be comfortable to a certain extent, it's bad from a cleanliness point of view because they're very far in on the cubicle bed, and they do tend to dirty it quite a lot. So again, if they lift their tail to defecate, they do tend to dirty the back of the cubicle. Whereas if we can encourage cows to be aligned correctly in the cubicle itself and positioned in terms of a lying position, so the cubicle is lining the cow up as to where we want them to lie, but a brisket board is actually going to dictate how far forward she lies in that cubicle. And ideally, you would like the tail to be basically hanging over the edge of the cubicle so that they don't into the passageway rather than onto the bed. So a brisket board can be effective in that sense, in that it keeps the cow back a little, I suppose. Again, that's just going to be down to observation. Like some people have quite long cubicles. Cows that we have now, by virtue of the breeding index that we're embracing, I suppose, are making cows a little bit shorter, smaller probably to an extent. So compared to what cubicles might have been on farms a couple of years ago, we may now have a smaller cow that's inclined to lie a bit further forward on the cubicle. And while that's not compromising her comfort really, it is compromising the cleanliness of the cubicle bed. The other risk with cows lying too far forward in cubicles is that they can actually get stuck in them. And that's a bit of a nightmare scenario for anyone that's experienced it from time to time. And obviously, the brisket board, again, will kind of just force them to lie back further on the cubicle. So when they do stand up, they're not caught by the neck rail as much when they're trying to get up, and then they don't get into that panicky situation where they can't get up, but they can't move forward or backwards either. So they eventually get stuck because they kind of keep crawling forward. So brisket boards are useful in that sense as well, in terms of just encouraging the cow to lie in the right position in the cubicle. So look, I talked about the stocking rate already, but I suppose it's something that's worth pointing out again. Overstocked sheds are going to be hard to keep clean because you have a lot of cows. If you have too many cows for the number of cubicles that you have kind of a waiting phase going on all the time. So there'll be cows at the barrier feeding. There'll be the cows that have gotten up last, possibly because they wanted to stay lying down for longest. So they go out to the feed barrier to have least competition for feeding. The other cows then that are standing around waiting for those cubicles to become available are hopping into them and spending as long as they can in them. And sometimes you can find scenarios, especially if a cow gets lame, that they will just stay lying in the cubicle because they know that they're not going to get an opportunity to get a cubicle again if they get up. So I suppose what we need to do there in those scenarios is maybe look at the plan for the winter. I suppose I would be suggesting that people would look at their milk recording reports and identify are there cows that they could be offloading before the winter to help reduce the stocking rate in the shed. Maybe even cows that might be in calf that aren't cows that are going to be milked on the farm the coming year. Should you be looking to part company with them in advance of housing in order to try and have an impact in terms of the stocking rate of the shed and the overall hygiene of the shed as well. Then, as I said, that overstocking is going to contribute to ventilation issues as well as just making it trickier for you yourself to navigate around the sheds, to look at cows. Generally, if cubicles are overstocked, feed barriers are overstocked as well, and that's another issue in terms of feed access and how cows can operate over the dry period, and also trying to deal with cows that need special attention in terms of body condition and so forth as well. So I suppose just to emphasize again the importance of a clean, dry environment for the cow to lie in. That environment needs to be particularly clean and dry in the immediate post-dry off period. But it needs to be clean in general, I suppose. But just to emphasize that we need to reduce the exposure of the udder to bacterial loading in the immediate post-dry off period. And again, in reality, just before cows start to calve as well, they need to be managed as well, quite well in that scenario. And that in itself produces, that means that you have a lot of cubicles to do, because the vast majority of people are calving a lot of cows in a very short space of time now, whereas the drying off probably isn't happening as quickly as calving tends to occur. So clean, dry cubicle, bedded with whatever material is your preference. I suppose sawdust is going to dry. There are bacterial properties associated with peat, and then lime, obviously, depending on the lime that you use, has a drying effect, but also a very good pH adjustment, which is very strong in terms of killing bacteria as well. So whatever product you're using, I suppose sawdust has the advantage that it's going to be a little bit warmer and drier as well, potentially, and it offers a soakage that lime probably doesn't. The other thing that people could do is, as I said already, is maybe consider treating cubicles with the disinfectants maybe. So there's a number of them out there. That disinfectant limes can be used, or disinfectant sprays can be used, which will dry very readily because you're not using a large volume of product when you're using them. And again, all this is just contributing to trying to keep the bacterial load down during the dry period. And look, much of what's been said here in relation to the dry period is important, as I said at the outset, in relation to milking cows when they do calve in next January and February, that the cubicle environment that they're lying in is maintained in a high level of cleanliness and dryness as much as possible to minimize the risk of bacteria entering the udder, because obviously cows that are freshly calved will be definitely have a greater level of oedema than a cow that's been dried off. They could be leaking milk obviously as well, which is putting liquid into that environment. So our cubicle now needs to be able to handle that, as I said, to shed the liquid. The material that we're using to bed it needs to be able to disinfect against any pathogens that might be associated with that. And overall comfort and cleanliness of those cubicles is very important. So that's how winter housing can contribute significantly to our drying off. If we don't have that in the right situation, I suppose for the coming winter, you need to be very careful if you're going to go down the route of selective, especially the stocking rate element of it. I suppose if you are going to go down the selective route, you'd want very good advice, and you need to talk to your vet, and there will be the opportunity for consultations through AHI in relation to that, and Noel McCoy will talk about that on next week's webinar briefly. Then identifying those right cows and then having the environment correct for that is going to be important. So just to, as I said, Cell Check Week is happening next week. This is just to give you an idea of what's happening. There's going to be videos released over social media over the coming week relating to the importance of why we need to move away from antibiotic usage in a blanket sense for dry cows. There's Francis Quigley in Kildalton will have a video in relation to housing. So what I've been talking about today, we'll be looking at how you do the tubing element of it effectively, I suppose. So there's a risk that we're introducing bacteria when we are tubing potentially. So again, many of you may have seen this over the last number of years with the cell check farm events that we've done in the past. That how you do that successfully is important in terms of achieving a positive outcome in terms of drying off. And then we move to the housing element, as I said. Then if we've done it right in the parlour when we've dried off, if we do the next element right in terms of the housing, or we have our housing right, then we can actually potentially move into this selective dry cow therapy quite successfully. But we need to do it under guidance, I suppose. Milk recording obviously then is going to be the focus of Thursday's video. It's going to be very important. Obviously, more co-ops are beginning to make it compulsory, and more co-ops are looking at making it compulsory. And it's obviously an important element in relation to identifying cows that do need an antibiotic. So there are cows out there that are going to need an antibiotic, and that will be okay. But we will need to be able to prove that those cows do need that antibiotic. So that video is going to focus on that. And then finally, as I said, it's just that there is funding available through rural development programs, through AHI, under what's called the Teagasc funded dry cow consult. So you can consult with your vets, and most of the vets in the country now at this stage are trained in relation to these consults, in terms of helping you to decide whether it's appropriate or not for you to try selective this year, and what program you can put in place if it's not appropriate for you to do that, what you need to do to position yourself to be ready to take it on next year. So we'll leave it at that for today. As I said, next week, Willie Buckley and Finola will be talking about different elements. So Willie will be talking about identifying the cows using the reports that are suitable for selective, and we'll say what to do with the ones that aren't. And Finola will just give further details in relation to how people can access these dry cow consults through their vets. And Willie's one of those vets that's doing those consults on a regular basis with the last number of years, and he'll be able to add to that as well. So that's it for today. We thank you for tuning in, and we wish you all the best for the coming week, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.